Welcome back to Midnight Fables. Tonight, we descend into the soot-stained streets of Oakhaven, a city where the gears of industry are turned by the hands of the dead. But what happens when a corpse refuses to forget? What happens when a grave cleaner finds a secret that the High Inquisitors would kill to keep buried? This is a 30-minute journey into the heart of a silent conspiracy, a tale of salt, wire, and the heavy price of the truth. Dim the lights, settle in, and listen closely. This is The Final Witness. The sprawling, putrefying city of Oakhaven did not bury its problems. It simply gave them a shovel and told them to get to work. Above the soot-stained cobblestones, the spires of the elite, residences of the architects and the alchemists, reached for a sky they had long since choked with the incessant, acrid coal smoke. But beneath the street level, in the damp, claustrophobic warrens of the Undercity, where daylight was a forgotten myth, the dead provided the muscle. They were called shamblers, corpses preserved with potent alchemical salts and galvanized by intricate networks of copper wires stitched directly into their decaying nervous systems. They hauled the coal from the deep mines. They scrubbed the perpetually overflowing sewers. They toiled in the factories that churned out the very smog that suffocated the city. And they moved with a silent, terrifying obedience, an unnatural efficiency that made the living feel like relics of a bygone, inefficient age, until the spark faded. When the fragile alchemy soured, when the animating current weakened, the shamblers became jagged, turning into mindless, violent husks that tore through the living with the sheer, unbridled strength of rot-toughened sinew and unfeeling bone. That was where Kaelen came in. He was a grave cleaner. A man whose soul had become as weathered and gray as the corpses he hunted in the endless twilight of the Undercity. His heavy leather duster, perpetually stiff with dried grime, was treated with potent vinegar and ash to mask the pervasive scent of decay that clung to every brick and every breath. And his wide-brimmed hat cast his eyes into a permanent, unreadable shadow, reflecting nothing but the dim glow of alchemical street lamps. In his gloved hand, the leather worn smooth by countless grips, he carried a static rod, a heavy iron mace tipped with a glowing, pulsing blue quartz that could snap the delicate silver wires of a shambler with a single localized surge of raw energy. To Kaelen, the dead weren't people. They were malfunctioning machines. A persistent, unfortunate mess that needed to be scrubbed from the ledgers of the living. A necessary evil, perhaps, but an evil nonetheless. The rain in the Undercity wasn't water. It was a greasy, black runoff from the upper district, smelling of copper, old machine grease, and the faint, metallic tang of stale blood. Kaelen waded through the knee-high slush, his heavy boots splashing rhythmically against the slick, uneven cobblestones. He had been tracking a rogue shambler for 3 grueling hours, a former city watchman named Elias Thorne. Thorne had been raised 6 months ago after a botched robbery in the affluent gold district, and his official ledger entry listed him as a Grade 1 laborer. But something had gone profoundly wrong. He hadn't just gone jagged. He had disappeared into the deepest, most forgotten vents of the low wards, and 3 other cleaners had already gone missing trying to find him. Kaelen stopped at the entrance to a collapsed tenement, the air thick with the smell of wet limestone, decaying plaster, and the sharp, ozone sting of a failing alchemical heart. He pulled a small brass lantern from his belt and gave it a sharp flick. The pale green light illuminated the crumbling walls, revealing a series of frantic, jagged markings etched into the soot-stained stone. They weren't the random scratches of a mindless beast. They were letters, crude, shaking, and written in the dark, but letters nonetheless. Kaelen felt a cold finger of unease trace a line down his spine. The dead weren't supposed to remember how to write. They weren't supposed to remember anything at all. The very concept challenged everything he believed about his grim profession. Kaelen knelt by the mysterious markings, his gloved fingers tracing the deep, desperate grooves in the crumbling stone. The word was murder, repeated over and over until the desperate letters bled into one another in a chaotic, swirling spiral. It was a desperate cry, a primal shriek from a mind that was supposed to be a blank slate of alchemical salts and inert copper wire. He adjusted the grip on his static rod, the quartz tip humming with a low, predatory vibration that seemed to match the uneven thrumming of his own pulse, now quickened by a growing sense of dread. He had seen awakened dead before, exceedingly rare cases where the soul clung to the meat like a burr to wool, defying the very laws of their existence. But they were usually weeping, gibbering husks, not focused scribes trying to communicate a secret. He pushed further into the collapsed tenement, the floorboards groaning under his weight with a sound like snapping bone or dry kindling under a heavy boot. The darkness here was absolute, a heavy, velvet weight that seemed to swallow the meager green glow of his lantern whole, leaving only oppressive blackness. He reached a heavy iron door at the back of the building, its hinges rusted solid with years of disuse and damp. With a grunt of effort, he shouldered it open, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the empty, desolate halls like the piercing scream of a banshee. Inside, the room was a chilling shrine to obsession. Thousands of scraps of parchment, brittle with age, stolen ledgers from forgotten archives, and pieces of charcoal were strewn across the floor, all covered in the same frantic, jagged handwriting. The air was thick with the dust of old paper and the lingering scent of formalized flesh. In the corner, slumped against a crate of rusted gears, sat Elias Thorne. He was a tall man, or he had been once. Now his skin was the color of a winter bruise, pulled agonizingly tight over a frame of heavy bone, barely concealing the underlying structure of his skeletal form. Silver wires snaked out of his neck, disappearing into the collar of his tattered, stained blue watchman's tunic. His eyes were milky white, clouded by the pervasive salts that arrested decay, giving them an almost ethereal glow in the gloom. But as Kaelen entered, they snapped toward him with a terrifying, lucid focus. Thorne didn't growl, he didn't lunge, he didn't exhibit any of the mindless aggression of a jagged. He simply raised a shaking, skeletal hand and pointed at a stack of ledgers on the table. His jaw worked silently, the muscles having long since rotted away to nothing, leaving him unable to speak a single audible word. The sound that came out of his throat was a dry, rattling hiss, like wind blowing through a field of dead, brittle reeds. He tapped his chest with a bony finger, then pointed to the upper district spires visible through a high, grimy window, their distant lights mocking the darkness of the Undercity. Kaelen kept his static rod raised, its blue light reflecting off Thorne's dead eyes. "You're jagged, Elias," Kaelen said, his voice a low growl, filled with the practiced indifference of his trade. "I'm here to settle the debt. I'm here to turn off the spark." Thorne shook his head, a slow, deliberate, human movement that stopped Kaelen in his tracks. The watchman reached for a piece of charcoal and with agonizing slowness began to write on the floor once more. His desperation was palpable. The charcoal snapped in Thorne's stiff, unfeeling fingers, but he didn't stop. He pressed the sharp shard into the stone with such frantic force that his fingernails cracked, leaving dark smears of old preserved blood alongside the black carbon. Kaelen watched, fascinated and horrified as a name began to take shape. Lord Baron. The name of the city's High Inquisitor, the man who oversaw the very alchemy that raised the dead. The architect of the Shambler program itself. Kaelen felt a cold sweat break out across his brow beneath his hat. He was a simple cleaner, his work confined to the forgotten alleys and the damp sewers. He didn't deal with the high houses. He dealt with the refuse they left behind. Now he was standing in the middle of a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of Oakhaven. Thorne looked up at him, the milky white of his eyes seeming to plead for a moment of understanding, for recognition that he was still there. He grabbed a heavy, leather-bound ledger from the stack and shoved it toward Kaelen with surprising strength. The pages were damp and smelled of the sewers and mold, but the ink was still starkly legible. It was a manifest, a list of names, hundreds of them, all citizens who had disappeared during the Great Fever, a virulent plague that had swept through the low wards 2 years prior. Beside each name was a chilling detail, a price and a destination: the Inquisitor's private labs. They hadn't died of fever. They had been taken while they were still breathing, turned into shamblers while their hearts were still beating to save on the cost of the initial galvanization. This was a horror beyond anything Kaelen had ever imagined. Kaelen flipped through the pages, his gloved hands trembling, the leather rustling with each turn. He saw names he recognized, neighbors from his childhood, friends of his father who had vanished without a trace, even a girl he had once seen selling lavender in the market, her smile as bright as the morning sun. It was a factory of the soul, a massive, hidden industry of suffering built beneath the very feet of the oblivious elite. Thorn tapped the ledger again, his bony finger pointing to his own throat. He traced a jagged scar that ran from ear to ear, a line of angry purple against his decaying flesh. He hadn't been killed by a petty robber. He had been silenced by the very men he served, because he had seen the wagons entering the labs in the dead of night, filled not with corpses, but with the desperately ill. "You're a witness," Kaelen whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. "You're the only one left who can prove it." Thorn nodded, a single tear of thick, yellow, embalming fluid leaking from his milky eye and rolling down his cheek. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own rotting meat, fighting the encroaching fog of the jagged state just long enough to pass on the truth. The blue quartz on Kaelen's mace flickered, its light dimming as if it sensed the immense weight of the revelation. Kaelen looked at the heavy iron door they had entered through. He could hear the distinct sound of heavy, armored boots on the cobblestones outside. The Inquisitor's men, the Hushers, were coming to finish what they had started. They were coming for Elias, and now they were coming for Kaelen too. The sound of the boots grew louder, a rhythmic, ominous, iron-shod beat that signaled the imminent arrival of the city's most efficient killers. The Hushers didn't use crude maces or blunt magic to silence their targets. They used long, thin, poisoned needles designed to pierce the base of the skull, severing the connection between soul and body in an instant, rendering even an awakened shambler inert. They were the cleaners of the cleaners. The elite enforcers who made sure the darkest secrets of Oakhaven stayed buried deep in the silt of the low wards. Kaelen looked at Thorn, who was now desperately trying to scrawl a complex diagram onto the rough-hewn wood of the table, a precise, detailed map to the hidden, unofficial entrance of the labs, a back door only a watchman would know. "We have to move. Now," Kaelen said, his voice tight with an urgency he hadn't felt in years, a primal fight-or-flight instinct he thought he had long since buried. He reached out and grabbed the watchman's stiff arm, the flesh feeling like cold, wet leather beneath his glove. Thorn stood, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, the silver wires in his neck whining and sparking faintly as they strained to move his stiffened joints. He gathered the ledgers into a tattered sack, his movements frantic and desperate, like a dying man trying to gasp one last breath. He knew his time was running out. The spark within him was flickering. The blue-white energy that gave him motion and what remained of his mind was turning into a sickly, pulsing orange, the undeniable sign of a shambler finally going jagged, the last vestiges of sentience being consumed by primal hunger. They moved through the back of the tenement, slipping out into a narrow, winding alleyway choked with the black, greasy fog of the ubiquitous coal furnaces. Kaelen led the way, his static rod held low, its blue light extinguished to avoid detection in the oppressive gloom. He knew these winding streets, these forgotten passages, better than any man alive. But tonight they felt different. Every shadow seemed to hold a concealed needle. Every drip of stagnant water sounded like a hushed footstep. He looked back at Thorn, who was struggling desperately to keep up, his legs dragging through the slick, knee-deep slush. The watchman's head was beginning to loll violently to the side, his jaw hanging open in a silent, eternal scream of agony. A whistle pierced the air, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the low hum of the city like a knife. A husher stepped out from behind a stack of rusted crates, his face hidden behind a terrifying mask of dark glass and brass filters, his presence radiating cold, clinical menace. He didn't speak. He simply raised a pneumatic wrist launcher with practiced ease. Kaelen dove to the side with a desperate lunge as a silver needle hissed through the black air, burying itself with a sickening thud in the brickwork where his head had been a second before. He rolled and came up swinging, the static rod roaring to life with a blinding flash of blue energy. He caught the husher in the chest, the localized surge of power throwing the masked man backward into a pile of refuse and broken glass. But there were more of them, many more, 4, 5, maybe a dozen, emerging from the thick, greasy fog like wraiths of iron and silk, their needles glinting menacingly in the dim light. Kaelen knew this was a fight he couldn't win alone. Kaelen backed away into a dead-end courtyard, its walls slick with algae and grime, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. Thorn was behind him, clutching the tattered sack of ledgers to his chest as if it were a living child. The watchman was trembling violently now, a low, guttural growl finally beginning to emanate from his rotting throat. The jagged state was rapidly taking hold, the primal, violent hunger of the meat starting to override the fading memories of the man. If Thorn turned now, if he succumbed fully to the feral instinct, he would be more dangerous to Kaelen than all the hushers combined. He would become a whirlwind of rot and fury, and the vital secret would be lost forever in the ensuing bloodbath. "Stay with me, Elias," Kaelen shouted over the rising, acrid wind that whipped through the alleyways. "Just a few more blocks. Hold on to the map. Hold on to your mind." He swung his static rod in a wide, desperate arc, the blue sparks dancing violently off the damp cobblestones, keeping the hushers at bay for a fleeting moment. The masked assassins circled them, their movements silent and predatory, like a pack of wolves cornering their prey. They didn't fear the cleaner, they were built for this, trained to hunt down those who saw too much. They moved in unison, a cold, choreographed dance of death. One lunged with a short, wickedly sharp blade, while another fired a second needle from his wrist launcher. Kaelen parried the blade, the impact vibrating up his arm and momentarily numbing his shoulder, but the needle grazed his thigh, sending a jolt of cold, chemical paralysis through his leg, bringing him crashing down. He fell to one knee, his vision swimming, the world seeming to tilt violently on its axis, the high spires of Oakhaven appearing to lean in to crush him under their massive weight. He saw a husher stand over him, the long, thin needle gleaming menacingly in the pale green light of a nearby street lamp, aiming for his eye. He tried to raise the mace, to summon one last surge of defiance, but his arm felt like it was made of lead, heavy and unresponsive. Then a massive shadow fell over him. It wasn't a husher. It was Thorn. The watchman had dropped the sack of ledgers and was standing over Kaelen, his decaying frame seemingly expanding, swelling with the terrifying, unnatural power as the jagged fury finally took full, desperate hold. His silver wires were glowing a violent, angry red, hissing and sparking as they scorched the dead flesh around them, the air crackling with raw alchemical energy. Thorn roared, a sound that was half human agony, half grinding stone. He caught the husher's wrist as it descended and snapped it like a dry twig with a sickening crunch, then threw the man across the courtyard with a strength that was purely alchemical, born of desperation and a dying will. The other hushers hesitated, their glass masks reflecting the terrifying sight of an awakened, jagged thing defending its prey. Thorn didn't stop. He became a blur of tattered blue tunic and sparking silver wire, tearing into the killers with a desperate, protective rage. He wasn't just fighting for his own existence. He was fighting for his witness. He was a dead man protecting the only living person who cared about the truth he had carried to his grave and beyond. The courtyard became a maelstrom of metal, flesh, and fading memory. The courtyard was a scene of absolute, unspeakable carnage, a testament to a dead man's final, desperate will. The Hushers, usually the undisputed masters of silent termination in the Undercity, were being systematically dismantled by a creature that shouldn't exist, a force of pure, reanimated fury. Kaelen watched from the ground, his legs slowly regaining feeling as the Husher's paralytic finally wore off, the cold numbness receding. He saw Thorn catch a needle in the shoulder and pull it out without a flinch, the wound weeping black ichor but failing to slow him, his movements becoming terrifyingly more fluid as the jagged state reached its peak. But the cost was visible in the dim light. The angry red glow of the wires was fading into a dull, ashen gray. Thorn was burning out his very essence, expending the last vestiges of his alchemical life force to buy them a few more precious minutes. His body was failing, but his will was still defiant. When the last Husher lay motionless in the mud, broken and discarded like a malfunctioning toy, Thorn turned back to Kaelen. The violent red light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dim, flickering white. He slumped against a cold, damp wall, his chest no longer heaving, his body finally beginning to realize it was a corpse that had defied its nature for too long. He reached into the sack of ledgers, his fingers fumbling, and pulled out a specific page, pointing to a detailed drawing of an eye, the Inquisitor's seal. Then, with agonizing effort, he pointed to a heavy sewer grate at the very edge of the courtyard, the entrance, the way in, the back door to the monster's lair. "You did it, Elias," Kaelen whispered, pulling himself to his feet and using the static rod as a cane, its blue light almost completely gone. "You gave them a name. You gave them a map. You gave them the truth." He took the sack from the watchman's cold, lifeless fingers. Thorn looked at the mace in Kaelen's hand, then looked into the cleaner's eyes, a silent, knowing plea. He nodded once, a slow, dignified movement. He was tired, so profoundly tired. He had carried the crushing weight of a city's sins for 6 agonizing months, trapped in a rotting shell, battling for his consciousness. And he was ready for the debt to be settled. He didn't want to be a shambler anymore. He didn't want to be a witness. He just wanted to be truly, irrevocably dead. Kaelen felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation he hadn't felt since he took the grim cleaner's vow 10 years ago, burying his emotions with the rest of Oakhaven's waste. He looked at the mace, the quartz now dark and silent. This was his job. This was what he was paid for, to turn off the spark, to erase the mess. But as he looked at Elias Thorn, he didn't see a mess. He saw a hero, a martyr for a truth that no one wanted to hear. "I'll make them pay, Elias," Kaelen promised, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar emotion. "I'll show the whole city what they've done. I'll make sure they remember your name, and the names of all those you tried to save." Thorn closed his eyes, a small, peaceful sigh escaping his lips as his last conscious breath fled his body. Kaelen raised the mace one last time, the dark quartz reflecting the falling rain. The surge of energy from the static rod was quick and silent, a final, merciful kiss. Kaelen watched as the last flicker of white light left Thorn's milky eyes, the silver wires in his neck turning cold and dull as the spark finally irrevocably died. The body slumped forward, a silent testament to defiance, finally at rest, a watchman on his final eternal beat. Kaelen didn't linger. He couldn't afford to. The remaining Hushers would have backups, and the High Inquisitor would already be moving to secure his labs. He grabbed the sack of ledgers, tucked the precious map, Thorn's last gift, into his belt, and with a grunt of effort, heaved open the heavy sewer grate with the head of his now useless mace. The air that rushed up from the deep tunnels was freezing, smelling of old death, industrial chemicals, and the faint, acrid tang of forgotten alchemical reagents. Kaelen descended the rusted iron ladder, his heavy boots echoing eerily in the hollow darkness of the primary wastelines. This was the true circulatory system of Oakhaven, the hidden arteries where all its filth, both physical and moral, eventually collected. He followed Thorn's crude, desperate map, his lantern cast low to avoid detection, the small green glow barely piercing the oppressive blackness. He moved past massive, churning turbines that powered the upper district's glittering elevators, through narrow, dripping pipes where the walls were coated in a thick, phosphorescent green slime that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. As he moved deeper into the forgotten depths, the distant sounds of the city above began to fade into a muffled hum, replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a massive heart made of iron and steam, beating deep within the bowels of the earth. He reached a junction that wasn't on any official map, a tunnel lined with smooth, almost pristine white porcelain tiles and brightly lit by high-end alchemical lamps that cast an eerie, clinical glow. This was the Vein, the private, hidden entrance to the Inquisitor's secret laboratory. Kaelen checked his static rod instinctively, then remembered its power was gone. The quartz was shattered, low on charge after the desperate fight in the courtyard, but it would have to be enough. He adjusted his hat, pulled his coat tight around his shoulders, and stepped into the stark, revealing light. He found himself in a vast, vaulted chamber, a cathedral of suffering, filled with rows upon rows of massive, cylindrical glass tanks. Inside each tank was a person. Some were old, their faces etched with the wisdom of years. Some were heartbreakingly young, their features still soft with youth. All of them suspended in a thick, amber fluid, their bodies perfectly preserved. Silver wires were being fed into their skulls by mechanical arms that moved with a terrifying, spider-like precision. This wasn't just a factory, it was a nursery for the New World Order. Lord Baron wasn't just recycling the dead, he was perfecting them. He was creating a workforce that would never sleep, never eat, never complain, and never rebel, because they would never know they were even alive. The scale of the horror was staggering. Kaelen walked through the endless rows of tanks, his reflection, gaunt and haunted, pale in the distorted glass. He saw faces that were frozen in expressions of eternal surprise, their eyes wide and staring into the amber depths, trapped between life and an enforced eternal labor. He felt a wave of profound nausea wash over him. He had spent his entire life cleaning up the jagged, thinking he was doing the world a favor, a grim but necessary service. But he had only been helping to hide the symptoms of a much deeper, more insidious rot. He had been complicit in this silent horror. He reached the end of the vast hall, where a massive, reinforced iron door stood guarded by two prime shamblers. Creatures that were more machine than meat, their decaying bodies encased in brass plating and powered by glowing, pulsating alchemical cores. They moved with an almost graceful, lethal precision, their every motion a testament to Baron's grotesque genius. "State your business cleaner," a voice boomed from the shadows, reverberating with cold authority. Lord Baron stepped into the stark light, his pristine white robes a stark contrast to the grime and decay of the lab. His face was a mask of cold, intellectual curiosity, his eyes gleaming with an almost unholy ambition. He held a small, silver remote that hummed with the same energy as Kaelen's shattered static rod. "You've traveled a long way to settle a debt, but I suspect you've brought me something much more valuable than a malfunctioning watchman." Baron gestured to the sack in Kaelen's hand, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. "The ledgers." Thorn was always an obsessive man, even in life. He couldn't let go of the numbers, the data, a flaw I thought I had corrected in his reanimation. Kaelen didn't answer immediately. He looked at the prime shamblers, their multiple eyes glowing with a steady, clinical blue, their massive frames radiating immense power. They were the pinnacle of Baron's work, perfectly obedient, perfectly lethal, and utterly devoid of anything resembling a soul. "You're a monster, Baron," Kaelen said, his voice raw, echoing in the vaulted chamber. "You're killing the living to build a city of the dead, a city of slaves. You think this is progress? It's just a graveyard with a budget, a horror on an industrial scale." Baron's smile widened, a thin, mirthless line that revealed nothing but his cold, unwavering conviction. "Progress requires sacrifice, Kaelen. Oakhaven was dying, choking on its own inefficiency. The living are weak, prone to fever and rebellion. The dead are loyal. They are the future of Oakhaven. Baron raised the remote, his thumb hovering over a single ominous button. Give me the ledgers, and I might let you leave. I might even let you keep your spark for a few more years. But if you refuse, well, I have an empty tank at the end of the row that would suit a man of your unique experience perfectly. A new prime, perhaps. An improved cleaner. Kaelen looked at the ledgers, then at the iron door. He knew he couldn't win a direct fight against two primes and an inquisitor with a dying mace. But he remembered Thorn's pleading eyes. He remembered the blood-written secret. He remembered the vow he had made in the mud. He gripped the shattered hilt of his static rod and felt the last desperate surge of energy in the quartz. It was enough for one final, defiant act. Kaelen didn't lunge for the Inquisitor. That would have been a fool's errand, an act of futile, meaningless violence. Instead, with a primal roar of defiance, he slammed the shattered static rod into the main control console next to the massive iron door. The fractured blue quartz exploded upon impact, releasing all its stored energy in a single catastrophic burst of crackling lightning and raw alchemical feedback. The console erupted in a shower of brilliant green flame and searing sparks. The silver wires throughout the vast room screeching with agonizing protest as the uncontrolled feedback loop hit the alchemical tanks. The amber fluid began to boil violently, churning and bubbling with immense heat. The mechanical arms flailing wildly as their intricate programming was fried by the overwhelming surge. The entire lab became a cacophony of destruction. The prime shamblers, deprived of their control signal, froze mid-stride, their massive alchemical cores flickering and dying with agonizing slowness. Lord Baron screamed, a sound of pure unadulterated rage and disbelief, as he watched his life's work, his grotesque vision of Oakhaven's future, dissolve into utter chaos around him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shrieked, his pristine white robes catching fire from the sparking wires, his face contorted in a mask of madness. "You've killed them all. You've destroyed the future. You've set us back centuries." Kaelen stood his ground amidst the inferno, the thick, acrid smoke filling his lungs, the searing heat of the fire blistering his exposed skin. "I didn't kill them, Baron," he choked out, tossing the empty mace hilt to the rapidly flooding floor. "I just gave them back their silence, their peace, their humanity." The alarms in the facility began to howl, a deep, rhythmic, blood-curdling sound that matched the thumping of the massive mechanical heart, now straining and sputtering. The black, oily sewer water from the upper pipes began to burst through the ruptured vents, flooding the chamber with the toxic runoff of the city, mingling with the boiling amber fluid. Kaelen grabbed the sack of ledgers, now damp but still intact, and ran for the service elevator at the far back of the room. He could see Baron, now a burning silhouette, desperately trying to salvage the rapidly exploding tanks. His hands burned raw, his eyes wild with unhinged madness. The High Inquisitor was being consumed by his own creation, the very alchemy he had mastered now turning into a corrosive, toxic sludge that dissolved his flesh. The elevator groaned as it slowly rose, protesting every inch of its ascent, the terrifying sounds of the laboratory's destruction fading beneath him into a muffled roar. Kaelen leaned against the cold metal wall, his body shaking uncontrollably, his mind a blur of fire and white tiles, of screaming shamblers and righteous fury. He had done it. He had broken the vein. He had stopped this particular horror. But he knew this wasn't the end. Baron was just one man, and Oakhaven was a city built on the silent, exploited labor of the dead. There were other labs, other inquisitors, other secrets hidden deep within the smog. He looked at the ledgers in his hand, the undeniable evidence of 1,000 murders. The debt wasn't settled yet. It was just getting started. This was only the first shot in a war no one else knew was coming. Kaelen emerged from a nondescript maintenance hatch near the opulent High District, the cool, relatively clean night air hitting him like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the inferno he had just escaped. He was covered in soot, thick oil, and the lingering, nauseating stench of the labs. A ghost of the Undercity, standing in the heart of the light, an unwanted specter. He looked at the ledgers one last time, their damp pages a heavy weight against his chest, before tucking them securely beneath his coat. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't go back to being a cleaner. He couldn't go back to ignoring the spark. He was the keeper of the names now. He was the final witness, the voice for 1,000 silent dead. He walked to the edge of the overlook, staring down at the vast, sprawling city of Oakhaven. From this vantage point, the lights looked deceptively beautiful, a glittering sea of amber and gold that artfully hid the rot beneath, the suffering upon which it was built. He could see the watchmen on their rounds, their blue tunics a stark, painful reminder of Elias Thorne, a ghost walking the streets he had once protected. He wondered how many of them knew the truth. How many were complicit? How many were already dead, just waiting for the wire? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, twisted silver wire he had scavenged from the ruined lab, a symbol of their suffering. He watched it catch the moonlight for a moment, before tossing it over the edge, into the abyss, a silent offering to the fallen. "Sleep well, Elias," he whispered to the biting wind, his voice raw with a newfound resolve. "The city's gonna hear your story in the morning, all of it." He began to walk, his heavy footsteps echoing on the clean, dry cobblestones of the upper district. He was heading for the presses of the City Gazette, the only place where the truth might stand a chance against the pervasive salt and the endless wire. He knew the Hushers would be looking for him. He knew Lord Baron, if he survived, would put a price on his head that would make every cleaner in the city his enemy, every shadow a potential assassin. But for the first time in 10 long, cynical years, Kaelen didn't feel like a man who worked for the dead. He felt fiercely, terrifyingly alive. The sun began to peek over the jagged horizon, a pale gray light that struggled to penetrate the thick, swirling coal smoke of Oakhaven. It wasn't a beautiful dawn, but it was a new one, a clean slate in a city built on old bones. Kaelen stopped in front of the heavy, ink-stained doors of the City Gazette office. He adjusted his hat, feeling the weight of the ledgers against his heart, and knocked with the strength of a man who no longer feared the dark. He had a story to tell, a debt to collect, and a city of the living to wake up. He was Kaelen, the grave cleaner, and his work had only just begun. The dead were finally silent, and now it was time for the living to scream. The silence of Oakhaven is deep, but as Kaelen found, the truth has a way of screaming. If you enjoyed this descent into the Undercity, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep the green flames burning and the stories coming. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in a city built on the dead, would you have the courage to knock on that door? Until next time, stay in the light, and thank you for listening.